The battle to contain Ebola. Is enough being done to halt its spread? Are mandatory quarantines and travel bans the answer? Dr. Timothy Flanigan joins us from Liberia, along with Dr. Mark Abruzze, an infectious specialist here in D.C. And the story of one woman's journey from atheism to faith and true happiness. Blogger and author Jennifer Fulwiler joins us to talk about her new memoir. And finally, millions of children and adults have read her books. Acclaimed children's author of modern classics Because of Winn-Dixie and The Tale of Despero, Kate DICAMILLO, joins us. The World Over Live begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. Doctors Tim Flanigan, who is battling Ebola in Liberia, and Mark Abruzze, as well as Jennifer Fulwiler and Kate DICAMILLO are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send us a tweet at Raymond Arroyo or email us at worldover@EWTN.com. We have so much to cover. Let's get right to it. Here's the brief. News from the world over this week. The press is once again turning their attention to Pope Francis and his purported agenda to change the Catholic Church. On Wednesday, the Associated Press titled a story, quote, "Pope maps out personal and progressive policy." According to the report, Pope Francis has made the most important policy speeches of his pontificate in recent days. Among them, Pope Francis reiterated the Vatican's strong opposition to capital punishment while speaking to a group of penal lawyers. He also denounced life imprisonment as a hidden death penalty. Prison systems, he said, are, quote, out of control and depriving people of their dignity. He denounced detaining people without charge or conviction and holding inmates in isolation, which the Pope called a form of physical and psychological torture. Pope Francis also reiterated the Church's position on evolution, mainly that, quote, evolution in nature doesn't contradict the notion of creation, because evolution presupposes the creation of beings who evolve. This idea has been advanced by his predecessors, St. John Paul, as well as Benedict XVI. During a speech on Tuesday, he promised an encyclical on the environment and lent his support to workers' rights. As he concluded, he mused, "If I talk about this, some people will think that the Pope is communist. They don't understand that love for the poor is at the center of the gospel." Less reported this past week was Pope Francis's strong defense of the family. During comments he made Saturday to members of the Schoenstatt movement, the Pope lamented the attacks upon the Christian family and a growing relativism over the concept of marriage. He said, too often there's a misunderstanding over the difference between the sacrament of marriage and the holy, or the social rite. He specifically mentioned, quote, people who just live together, who choose part-time cohabitation. Here are the new forms, totally destructive and limiting the greatness of marriage, end quote. In other news, the insurgency of Boko Haram continues its advance in northeastern Nigeria. The jihadist militants have seized the commercial city of Mumbai. This after a fierce gun battle with Nigeria's military, who eventually retreated. The latest Boko Haram victory and escalated attacks come after a highly publicized ceasefire agreement with Nigeria's government 2 weeks ago. The ceasefire led to hopes that the more than 200 schoolgirls abducted by Boko Haram back in the spring might soon be released. Meanwhile, the kidnappings continue. 70 young women, teenage girls, and boys have been kidnapped in recent days from villages throughout northeast Nigeria. Escapees have told Human Rights Watch that the abducted are raped, forced to marry, and in some cases convert to Islam. USA Today is reporting that the once social conservative bedrock of Latin America is making a quick and stunning turn to the left. Uruguay has led the way in recent years, passing laws legalizing gay marriage and abortion. But they're hardly alone. Despite the region's overwhelmingly Catholic population, gay marriage is now recognized among Uruguay's larger neighbors, Brazil and the Pope's own Argentina. Same-sex civil unions are now legal in Mexico, Costa Rica, Colombia, and Ecuador. Abortion has become legal to some extent in 9 Latin American countries. USA Today notes that 1/4 of the nearly 500,000 green cards issued in the U.S. last year went to people from Latin America, and the vast majority of undocumented immigrants come from the region. Immigration could have profound effects on the political landscape of the United States in the years to come. After creating a First Amendment firestorm, the city of Houston announced on Wednesday that it is backing off its controversial subpoenas of 5 Christian pastors. Mayor Anise Parker subpoenaed the sermons and other church documents after the city council was sued for passing an anti-discrimination ordinance to protect gay and transgender Houstonians. The pastors were not part of the lawsuit, but support a repeal of the ordinance. Parker said that after meeting with religious leaders and listening to their concerns, she decided it was best for the city to drop the subpoenas. The tipping point may have been the 1,000 sermons and Bibles she received in the mail from pastors across the U.S. This was orchestrated by former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee on his Fox News program. Meanwhile, religious freedom took a small step forward in Cuba. For the first time in the 55-year reign of the Castro brothers, the government is allowing the construction of the country's first new Catholic church. Much like other communist regimes, the Catholic Church had tense relations with the atheist government for many years after the 1959 revolution. They began to improve ahead of Pope John Paul II's visit in 1998. Small concessions from the government continued through Pope Benedict's 2012 visit. The church will be built in the far western town of Sandino and is being funded by the faithful of St. Lawrence Parish in Tampa, Florida. Currently, the town of 40,000 does not have a place of worship. And some major restructuring is coming to the Archdiocese of New York as Cardinal Timothy Dolan has announced the closure of more than 50 parishes. That is more than 1 out of every 8 parishes in the Archdiocese. A closure plan has been in the works since Cardinal Dolan's arrival in New York in 2009. In his weekly Archdiocesan column, the Cardinal cited the reality of understaffing and financial stress, writing, "We have too many parishes in areas where the Catholic population has shrunk." He noted specifically Manhattan's 88 parishes, many just blocks apart, serve less than 12% of New York's Catholics. The pastors and faithful of the parishes to be closed will be informed as soon as this week, before the Archdiocese makes a public announcement. And a possible major discovery in the art world: Caravaggio's long-lost painting, Mary Magdalene in Ecstasy, is believed to have been found. Several copies of the painting exist, but the original, which Caravaggio was believed to have been possessing just before he died in 1610, had disappeared. Top Caravaggio scholar Mimi Gregori announced that she's found the painting in a private collection. She said she knew instantly the piece was the missing Caravaggio. A note on the back of the painting says it was commissioned by one of Caravaggio's most important patrons, Roman Cardinal Scipione Borghese. Italian daily La Repubblica was allowed to photograph it in an exclusive, but the owners thus far have indicated no interest in displaying the piece for the public. When we return, the Ebola epidemic continues to claim lives in West Africa, but are we doing enough to contain the disease elsewhere in the world? The CDC admits that it can be spread in a new way. We'll tell you how. Doctors Timothy Flanigan and Mark Abruzzi will tell us when The World Over continues. Stay right there.
Once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over. According to the World Health Organization, about 5,000 people have died after contracting the Ebola virus, mostly in the three most affected regions in West Africa: Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. The World Health Organization reports this week that the rate of new cases is slowing significantly. At the same time, policymakers around the globe are instituting travel bans and quarantines to stop the spread of Ebola in their respective countries. What is the best way to contain this virus? Joining us tonight from Monrovia, Liberia, via Skype is Brown University medical professor Dr. Timothy Flanigan. He's on the ground battling Ebola on the front line, and here in studio is Dr. Mark ABRUZZESE. He's the chair of the Infectious Disease Control and Prevention Committee at Sibley Memorial here in Washington, D.C. And joining us by phone is Dr. Meryl Nass of the Institute for Public Accuracy. Thank you all for being here. I want to start with you, Dr. Flanigan. What are you seeing on the ground? What are you most in need of as you combat this terrible virus? And I know you've been in the midst of it for 2 months now.
Yes, well, I came over at the very end of August, actually the last flight in from Accra in Ghana, and I joined the Catholic Health Network, and they were doing working incredibly hard to take care of patients with really very, very little. And at that time, things were, there's no other way to describe it, they really were out of control, and the system was overwhelmed. There were not enough beds in the Ebola treatment units. The efforts to take care of patients with Ebola just could not keep up with the number of patients that were ill. There were people that had died and dead bodies that could not be properly taken care of. And so the infection was continuing, and it really was spiraling out of control. We know how this is spread. We know that touching a body of someone who has died, or touching body fluids, or taking care of somebody who's infected without appropriate precautions will spread it. We had some good news recently. The international efforts have really kicked in. The Liberian medical community has really worked incredibly hard under very difficult conditions. And the number of new cases in Liberia, and particularly here in Monrovia, which is a huge challenge because it's a big, crowded, very poor, congested city, the numbers appear to be down. It doesn't mean we should lessen our efforts. We really need to redouble them, because one single case of Ebola is an outbreak. So we appear to be making progress, and that is really important.
Dr. ABRUZZESE, there seems to be a quasi-containment at this point, at least in Africa. I mean, the World Health Organization is still projecting 10,000 cases between now and December, 10,000 as we move forward. Your thoughts?
I can't predict the number of cases going forward, but as you said, and as we're hearing from the people on the ground, that containment, the number one principle in infection control and prevention, is to contain the process. And I think that we've contained it geographically. Now the boots on the ground, so to speak, will help us to further contain the process. So as we look at it from our standpoint on this side of the ocean, I think that we as a system are better equipped to handle the sporadic cases that we'll see.
I stand corrected, and I just checked my notes here. The World Health Organization is projecting 10,000 cases a week between now and December. That's an awful lot of cases.
It sure is, and I think that there'll be better reporting to maybe bring those numbers up, but I do believe there's going to be fewer transmissions as the word gets out through the countries where it is absolutely an epidemic proportion.
Dr. Flanigan, what is the first rule you all have when someone is brought in? How do you contain this? What's your first rule of prevention moving forward?
The number one rule is that this virus is spread from someone who is ill, not from someone who is well. So a person who is ill with Ebola, the number one rule is to identify it and to recognize it, and that's done through triage. Then the second is to provide care in a way that you limit the amount of contact with that patient. We actually use what we call no-touch care. That's difficult for those of us who have been trained in more traditional care, but we try and make sure that patients are adequately hydrated, that they can receive medications for other causes of fever, such as malaria, or antibiotics for antibacterial infections, and limit the contact. Then, of course, we try and use the Clorox or chlorine washes, which is effective at killing the virus. And then we, of course, use appropriate protective equipment, which we call PPE. And there have been a lot of efforts to make sure that it gets out there, that the trainings are done correctly, which they are. And that is what is dramatically better. I have to say, when I first came over, the fear here was palpable. People wanted to run and hide. No one wanted to go to the treatment units. And that, of course, made it incredibly difficult to control the epidemic. In the last few weeks, the community engagement is really totally different. Communities are now saying we have to protect ourselves from getting Ebola. So the communities are on the lookout. They're making sure that folks that are ill go to the Ebola treatment units. There's much wider availability of testing with the Ebola PCR. So the whole system is working better, from diagnosis.
Okay, but when somebody, Dr. Flanagan, when someone comes in, though, you have a policy where once that person, whoever carries that family member in or friend in, that individual is then quarantined, correct, for 21 days?
Absolutely, because that person has touched or been in the same house or been in very close proximity to someone who is ill. So that is the critical issue, that it's an ill person that transmits the virus. And when you're in that close contact, you definitely do want to observe yourself closely and make sure there's no further contact to break the chain of transmission.
I want to bring in this next topic, and we're seeing this play out here in the United States, really around the world. There is a nurse, former CDC employee, Casey Hickox. She was quarantined by New Jersey authorities when she arrived at Newark Airport following time in West Africa. Now she had a fever reading, though she did not test positive for Ebola. She was quarantined in New Jersey. She put up a fuss. They sent her home to Maine. Now she's refusing to abide by a 21-day quarantine. Today she went for a bike ride, and the Maine governor is threatening to step in. Here's what Casey Hickox is saying.
To prison me in my house for 3 weeks when you don't know whether I will develop disease or not. And when I don't have symptoms, I am self-monitoring. But I'm not willing to stand here and let my civil rights be violated when it's not science-based.
What do we make of self-quarantining? Dr. Abruzzi.
I think that the word quarantine is one that we use when we specifically tie people down, so to speak. But she doesn't need to self-quarantine. She needs to self-observe her symptoms. She needs to self-monitor. And as long as these people, and believe me, every one of these folks are educated folks. They went over to Liberia for a reason. They've come back. They know what the symptoms are. They do not want to be 4 days delayed in reporting their illness. So they will self-observe adequately and then self-report if they have a problem.
Okay, but we had Dr. Craig Spencer in New York. He didn't self-report. He was out bowling, and he went to the subway, and he got in the Uber car, and he went out to restaurants, and then he started to present symptoms. So he was carrying the virus all along. I want to bring Dr. Meryl Nass in. Your take on this. Is this a threat? Should there be a mandatory 21-day period of self-quarantine at home for anyone who's gone to this hotspot, particularly in close proximity to those who've been affected and infected by Ebola?
I'm actually agnostic on that question. I think you have to realize that Médecins Sans Frontières has had about 1,000 Western doctors and nurses come and serve in West Africa, and Dr. Spencer is the only one of them who has developed Ebola after he got home to his home country. So that's about a 0.1% risk. There are many other people coming back from West Africa, and we are not quarantining them. The nurse actually tested negative twice for Ebola, and yet she's being quarantined. The American ambassador to the UN has just gotten back from a fact-finding trip to West Africa. She hasn't been quarantined. So right now we don't seem to have any uniform standard, and we're not really assessing the risk on any kind of, regular way. And I think if we do start quarantining people, which I don't think I'm in favor of, I think that will only delay cases in the U.S. because some people will come in from places that we didn't know had Ebola, but may turn out to have been exposed, in ways that we're not aware of, just as the nurses were in Dallas.
Yeah. Dr. Abruzzi, this is an interesting point. The CDC this week released a poster. And in that poster, the quote is, and I'll just read this, droplet spread happens, droplet spread of the Ebola virus, when germs traveling inside droplets that are coughed or sneezed from a sick person enter the eyes, nose, mouth of another person. Now, the CDC previously said this was not airborne, could not be airborne, which contradicted that 2012 Canadian study on Ebola, which said it could indeed, and they had strong suspicion that it might be airborne. Your take on this, and shouldn't this send off some alarms for public policy folks?
I believe that we talk about different kinds of spread, and droplet simply means that we have it in a body fluid. It's not aerosol, which is unlike influenza virus, which
kills a whole lot more people than Ebola in the United States anyway.
Absolutely. And so we're really talking about if somebody happens to cough and happens to have some bloody secretions and you get exposed to that droplet, which is a body fluid, it's still body fluid spread. It's not.
Yeah, but it's airborne. I mean, it's traveling outside your body. You don't have to touch me to get it. If I sneeze and I'm in the theater and you're in front of me and it lands on you and you inhale it.
And these are the people who are most sick. Keep in mind the 40 people who were in touch with Mr. Duncan before he entered the hospital. He was sneezing, coughing, touching all those people. Nobody is sick. So,
Dr. Nass, your take on this?
Well, I think CDC has acknowledged for many years that Ebola may be transmitted in aerosol droplet nuclei. And that's why it's a BSL-4 organism. It's designated in the maximum containment. It has to, people who do research with Ebola have to have a separate air supply from the lab that they're working in. And that's because it is acknowledged by CDC in a number of documents that aerosol exposure is a potential problem. And in fact, healthcare workers are advised not to perform aerosol-generating procedures on patients who are suspected of having Ebola. And if you're on an airplane and you think a passenger may have Ebola, you are supposed to put a surgical mask on them so that if they're coughing or sneezing, there will be some confinement of these droplets.
But this seems to be a reversal, though, for the CDC, yes, or at least in a latter-day admission that this indeed can be transported through the air in some way.
Yeah, exactly, because they did say clearly that it couldn't be transmitted through the air. Then they put out the poster that said it could in droplets, and now they've taken back the poster, and we're waiting to see what they're going to come up with next.
Okay. I want to move on to what Chris Christie is doing. A number of other governors in other states, they're this is an ad hoc system we're seeing, ad hoc rolling policy. Chris Christie is responding to criticism about that mandatory 21-day quarantine in New Jersey for anyone returning from an Ebola hot zone. He thinks it's necessary. Listen.
I think folks should understand part of the sacrifice is going over there, and the remainder of the sacrifice is when you come home, if you've been, remember, a healthcare worker directly exposed to the virus, or now members of our military, have to be quarantined for 21 days. That's common sense policy. I don't know when the White House is going to get around to admitting that and not, giving us 7-minute lectures from the South Lawn, and just get to work. And that's what people want. They want their leaders to do things, and that's why Republican governors and Democratic governors have taken the same step that I did, and we're happy. New Jersey is proud to lead on this, to lead in the area of common sense. That's what we're doing, and we're not changing. I don't care what happens. We are not changing our policy.
So Christie says he's not changing his policy. This is bipartisan. You've got New Jersey, Illinois, California, New York. Isn't this being prudent, Dr. Abruzzi?
I don't think that they are looking at the facts. I don't think that they've looked at what we've learned over the past month and a half of dealing with this crisis over in West Africa. It simply doesn't follow what our data would tell us we should be following. We don't need to quarantine people who are well coming back from these countries.
But at what point, how do you figure out, I mean, if I'm carrying, because there are people like the doctor in New York, he didn't test positive until he started showing signs and presenting. And the question is, at what exact point do you become infectious? Is it when your temperature is 99, 101, 103? All this metric keeps shifting. So it does make novices and public policy experts and public servants a little wary about releasing somebody who could potentially be infectious on their population.
Yes, sick people are infectious to those around them. People who aren't not sick, or like Mr. Duncan, are not infectious to those around them. We heard it from the people that are over in that Liberia dealing with the situation. We've seen it in action here with Mr. Duncan's case. So to quarantine people who are not sick does not make sense because they're not infecting people around them.
Even if they could be carriers. You
Absolutely.
would be against
These people,
quarantining them.
Absolutely. These people are carrying Ebola in very low viral loads initially. They then go on to develop a viral load that's high enough to become infectious to others. They'll be symptomatic.
I want to show you this. This is President Obama. Dr. Nass, I'll get you to respond to this. Remember, the military is being quarantined. Any military returning from West Africa, they have a mandatory 21-day quarantine. Not so for medical workers. Listen.
The military is in a different situation, obviously, because they are, first of all, not treating patients. Second of all, they are not there voluntarily. It's part of their mission that's been assigned to them by their commanders and ultimately by me, the commander-in-chief. So we don't expect to have similar rules for our military as we do for civilians.
There seems to be an inherent incongruity in that bite where the president is quarantining military personnel who are far removed from the infectious individuals, and yet medical personnel are left to their own devices and can self-quarantine or not. As a public policy matter, is that a good idea?
I don't think it's a good idea to give mixed messages, whether you're part of the military, part of the government, or part of the civilian medical teams. I believe that we should all be doing things the same way so that the message to the public is uniform. It certainly would help to build confidence of the public that the Centers for Disease Control, the public, understand that it is a voice of medical reason, and that going forward we should probably talk in the same language.
Before I let Dr. Timothy Flanigan go, I just want to ask you about your personal decision to travel to Liberia to potentially expose yourself to this Ebola virus. I know some physicians you've worked with have contracted it. Thank God they've recovered. How much of your faith drove this decision to go? I mean, obviously you're training individuals at Catholic institutions. Tell me about that decision.
Sure. Thanks for asking about that. So about almost 2 years ago, I became a deacon in the Diocese of Providence, and I was the chief of infectious diseases at Brown University, and I stepped down to give myself a little extra time, but I'm working full-time as an infectious disease doctor as part of a major university, and along comes the Ebola epidemic. And I thought, gosh, you know, this is something I understand. We have a good sense of how this disease is transmitted. We understand that when folks are sicker, the viral load rises, they're at higher risk of transmission, and that it is possible to protect oneself. So I thought, here's a place that it would be natural to make a contribution. So at the middle of August, I started to email around, and I was lucky enough through Caritas to reach a wonderful nun, Sister Barbara Brilliant, who is a Franciscan missionary Mary, who works within the Catholic health sector here. And she said, sure, come along as a volunteer. I, of course, purchased evacuation insurance, but at the very bottom of it, in fine print, of course, it says, by the way, if you get Ebola, we certainly cannot help you. But I thought, you know, as an infectious disease doctor, I understand this, and I think I can really decrease the risk so that it's negligible. You know, my wife said, be careful and take care of yourself. And my colleagues at work said, be careful and don't do anything foolish. But if you can make a contribution, go for it. So I was able to volunteer and come on over. And in fact,
well,
many people come over.
We certainly wish you the best there, Dr. Flanigan. We're running out of time here, and I just want to bring Dr. Abruzze in for just one moment here. Are we going to see any sort of outbreak here in the United States, or you think this will be just one-off cases here and there, and this will be largely contained?
I believe one thing, and Dr. Flanigan said it earlier, that one case is an outbreak. So I do believe we'll have some coming over from overseas. Mm-hmm. I believe our hospitals and hospital systems are well prepared to take care of those individual cases. Within the District of Columbia, for sure, we have our DC Hospital Association, Department of Health. Everybody's working to operationalize good care for the people, mm-hmm. and moving them to appropriate places that can care
Very
for
quickly, them. Travel ban or no travel ban seems to have worked in these African nations.
I believe containment of epidemic areas are important. We're not quarantining and having travel bans on people with influenza. We need to be diligent to watch people for 21 days, but travel bans in general mm-hmm. are probably not going to help us.
Doctors, thank you all for your insight and important work. You can learn more about Dr. Timothy Flanigan's mission in Liberia by checking out his blog, timothypflaniganmd.com. And you can get the official information about Ebola by visiting the Centers for Disease Control website at cdc.gov. When we return, From Atheism to Faith and True Happiness, author of a new memoir, Something Other Than God, Jennifer Fulwiler joins us when The World Over returns. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over. My next guest found true happiness chronicling her journey on a blog called conversiondiary.com. But that isn't the whole story. She started out as an atheist who longed for something beyond the tangible. She's the author of a new memoir entitled Something Other Than God, How I Passionately Sought Happiness and Accidentally Found It. She recently joined me in studio. Here's my interview with Jennifer Fulwiler. Tell me about this title, Something Other Than God. This is a C.S. Lewis derivative.
It is.
Tell me about it.
It is. So as I was writing this book, initially I thought that this was just a story about finding God. But after I wrote my first draft, something was missing. The facts were there, but there's something missing from the story. And I realized it was ultimately a story about finding happiness, because the search for happiness had been driving me. Yeah. So I came across this wonderful quote from C.S. Lewis, a fellow former atheist, who says, "All that we call human history is the long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God, which will make him happy." So as soon as I heard that, and knowing it was a quest for happiness, I had my title, Something Other Than God.
Tell me, there's something that happens very early on. You're on a fossil hunt.
Yes.
And that moment kind of sets the course, begins this journey. Tell me about that.
What happened was, I was an amateur paleontologist, even as a child. My family owned some land, and in our part of Texas, it's rich with fossils. It used to be a shallow ocean, so tons of fossils there. And I had always gone hunting for fossils. I was an atheist child, and I'd always gone looking for these fossils, and I always thought of them as, these are the dead things, and I'm the alive thing. And this is just my paradigm. This is always how it will be. And one day when I was late in elementary school, at a pretty young age to realize this, but I suddenly held a fossil in my hand and realized my fate was no different than its own, that time would wash over me, and I would die and I would be gone. And that was the first moment in my life where it really hit me, kind of the meaninglessness behind my atheist worldview.
What a cheery child you were.
Great way to start a book, right?
Yeah, Morticia Adams, you know, a little scary. Tell me, you find C.S. Lewis. Now, you were an atheist, an affirmed atheist.
Very much.
How did you stumble into C.S. Lewis?
Well, that was, I had already begun the conversion process by the time I found C.S. Lewis. And he spoke my language. I tried to read all these other books by brilliant people who were lifelong believers, and we just missed each other. It was like we were speaking a different language. So C.S. Lewis, as a former atheist, could speak my language.
Why did you decide to blog about this in public? I mean, of all the things
Why
to
not,
blog
Raymond?
about, it's so intimate, it's personal, it's, you know, you're wrestling with things that are so deeply held, but then the world of faith beyond it. Why did you decide to open it up to other people?
It came naturally to me. First of all, I had a background as a web developer, so you know I'm one of those people. I was always online. But the other thing is, I mean,
this spiritual exhibition. I know. Is what I call it.
You know, actually, you know what I think it was more than that, because I was anonymous at first. I just went by the name Jennifer F. I did not know any Christians. You know, when you're a loudmouth atheist, you don't tend to have a great circle of faithful believers. So who am I going to ask these questions to? I couldn't ask my atheist friends.
Now, you did something interesting. You kind of begin a short-term experiment in Catholicism once you find Catholicism.
Right.
And you sort of put your feet. Tell me about that. Why a little trial period for, what was it, a month?
No, it was a couple of months where basically I realized, I got my first clue that God is not just something you read about in the pages of a book, oddly enough. That was actually news to me. I really thought that God was going to be a concept, that I would decide whether I believed in this concept or not. And it finally clicked for me that that's not how it works, that God is a being. He is a living person, and that I will not be able to connect with him if I don't put my heart in this as well.
Yeah.
And so thanks to Lewis, I realized that God is the source of all that is good. And if that is true, then the moral code he gives us through his church must be the path to goodness. So I tried out that moral code. I thought, okay, I'm going to live by the teachings of the Catholic Church, and we'll see if it brings more goodness into my life.
Well, and like Lewis, there's a little hiccup here in the action.
That's
because pain enters into this story, a little suffering. You realize you have this blood clot disorder.
Right.
And you're pregnant,
Yes.
which could be lethal.
Yes.
Tell me about that and how that refined your faith.
Okay,
or brought it out.
It did. So I had a deep vein thrombosis, which is a blood clot in a major vein. They can be fatal if it detaches and goes to your lungs. Yeah, it's very bad. And it was caused by a genetic clotting disorder, and that is exacerbated by pregnancy. So suddenly, I wasn't even Catholic yet, and I have all of these doctors saying you must be sterilized. It is the only course of action, or you must use artificial contraception. And suddenly, it put me face to face with the question of, do the rules of the Catholic Church, these rules that are so maligned in popular culture, do they really matter? Do I believe that they are true enough to make great sacrifices to follow them?
There was a great line that you mentioned that your father, I guess, imparted to you, and it was, never believe something because it's convenient or because it makes you feel good. Ask yourself, is it true? Did that become kind of a guidepost for you?
Very much. I mean, I often say that the way of thinking that I learned as a young atheist, it very much brought me to Catholicism because I was trained to seek truth above all. And that mentality directly led me to the foot of the Catholic Church.
What was the biggest challenge, the biggest obstacle for you?
I will say, honestly, it was this concept that God is a person. I could even follow the rules, even at the pain of sacrifice, but coming from that atheistic perspective, to have a relationship with someone you can't see is very difficult.
There's one part in the book you talk about visiting a cemetery and having a major revelation there. I'm from New Orleans, and we love our cemeteries.
Oh, yes.
Cemeteries are a thing of beauty. What was it there that, what light went on when you visited the cemetery?
So this is a cemetery where many of my ancestors are buried. My ancestors were crazy enough to come to Texas in the 1850s. So I was there to see my ancestors. So many of these graves are people I'm related to. And I always assumed that it was all adults at the cemetery. I had only seen their names. And while I was walking around one day, I looked at the dates and I realized half of the people here are children. It's practically a children's graveyard. And to think of these people who share my genetic material, they're my ancestors, to think of how many children they lost, it made me realize that my current worldview very much rested on having good health and longevity. And I thought, does my current worldview stand up when you lose it all, when you end up surrounded by the graves of children?
There was another moment in the book that I found a little odd, Jennifer. I have to bring this up.
Be honest.
I have to be honest. At one point, you pray not for Ella Fitzgerald, not for Frank Sinatra, not for Irving Berlin, for Tupac Shakur.
Yes.
Now, who am I to judge? But as somebody famously said. But why Tupac Shakur? What was this all about?
Okay, to this day, I will say that his music, not all of it, but a lot of his music resonates with me. Honestly, he is one of the more pro-life musicians that we've ever had. He has lyrics where he decries the horror of abortion and of you know, crimes against humanity. The reason why he resonated with me is many of his songs, not the popular ones, but many of his songs, he is was acutely aware of evil. And much like C.S. Lewis, he is someone who couldn't let it go, who couldn't live his life and be comfortable knowing that horrors were being committed in the world every day. And that really struck me, and I really felt a connection to him in that sense.
What do you think is the biggest block, if you will, to communication as well as understanding between this ever-growing atheistic chic that's out there? And let's face it, there are a lot of, I know a lot of young people, I have friends who are atheists because it's cool to be an atheist.
It's very cool.
How do you engage that in a way that isn't tired or trite and that really is effective?
I think you really have to engage. This sounds trite, but it's not. You have to engage with each person on an individual level, and especially if they are saying something about your faith that's offensive. It's tempting to get defensive and to try to show them how smart you are and to be combative. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think it's so important to see what's good about them and to compliment them. For example, if your nephew's spouting off, say, you know, you are so smart. Like you really have a keen mind. And I love it that you're asking these questions rather than saying, in your face, you're wrong, let me tell you about this doctrine. Yeah. Because it's very easy to get defensive because let's face it, the culture doesn't like Catholicism very much.
Is apologetics played out using scripture verses to prove? Is it played out, yes or no?
It's played out.
Thank you for being honest.
Thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with you because I think, particularly after reading your book, you realize that's not what really convinces or draws people. It is always witness. It's always the lived life, the life well lived.
Right.
You know, I can remember my wife. I mean, part of the thing that drew my wife, she saw Mother Teresa, met Mother Teresa.
Right.
That is one of those moments that you just don't shake.
Right.
And you've got to keep asking yourself, why would this woman do this and that and give so much of herself for years, helping these horribly disfigured, poor, dirty people, and yet embracing every moment because she wasn't doing it for them.
Right.
She was doing it for them, but beyond them as well.
Right.
And anyway, as I read it, I kept thinking, the apologetics thing really doesn't enter into this story.
It doesn't. I actually had people, you specifically mentioned the Bible verse thing. I went to a very religious college to begin with. I transferred away because it was too religious. And people would actually quote scripture at me, and I wanted to say, like, but I think it's fiction. Like, why are you talking to me about the Bible? I don't think it's inspired. That's irrelevant to me. And they weren't, again, like we said earlier, C.S. Lewis spoke my language. They weren't speaking my language. That was not the paradigm through which I saw the world.
Very interesting. No, well, I think for those with a literate background and those who really know the Bible, that can be an effective approach. But I think by and large, and today, I just don't think it's effective.
It's not.
I think the apologetics
not for atheists
is done. Yeah. What's the hardest part of Catholicism having come in?
Oh, wow. I
True
think,
confessions here, Jennifer Fulwiler.
Okay, true confessions. I think it is hard to be Catholic in this culture because my life is a lot harder than it was before I was Catholic.
In what way?
I have 6 kids. We live in a 3-bedroom house. I have this blood clotting disorder. I actually almost died in my last pregnancy. So those doctors who told me I shouldn't have any more kids, they're kind of right. And so, you know, keeping true to the Church's teaching about, you know, the beauty of the theology of the body and openness to life. I mean, it's all wonderful, and it's also a cross. It's difficult. And I'm overjoyed to be Catholic. Never for a single minute do I miss my old way of life. But this is a hard life that we live as Catholics.
Is it the people that make it hard?
What?
Do the people in the church make it hard to come to the church and stay in the church? Were they an obstacle in your path?
No, actually they weren't initially. And that is where, you know, having that blog I think really helped. I had this wonderful group of Catholic
supportive
readers.
Group.
They're very supportive, very helpful. Of course, I have had, you know, everyone. I mean, it's a fallen world. I mean, I have certainly encountered Catholics who challenge me, I guess you could say. But I will say, Raymond, this is the truth. Every time I go to an event full of faithful Catholics, I look around that room and I say, thank God I am on the right team. I finally found the right team.
Yeah. Something Other Than God, How I Passionately Sought Happiness and Accidentally Found It by Jennifer is available at bookstores everywhere, as well as online and through the EWTN Religious Catalog. She is the Library of Congress's National Ambassador for Young People's Literature. Over the last 14 years, she's distinguished herself writing for children, the recipient of the Newberry Honor and 2 Newberry Medals, sort of the Academy Awards of Kids Lit. My next guest is the author of some incredible works, Because of Winn-Dixie, The Tale of Despero, The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane, and many others. Her work is moving, soulful, and filled with redemption. I spent some time talking with Kate DiCamillo at the National Book Festival here in D.C. We chatted about the source of her fiction, her tips for getting kids to read, and something dear to my heart, the importance of stories. Here's an encore of my conversation with author Kate DiCamillo. Madam Ambassador, I want to start with, you have really been on a crusade, if you will, to inspire young people to read. And through your work, you've already done that. I was telling you a little bit ago about my 9-year-old who was in tears at the end of Edward Tulane.
Which made me cry, so we were off to a good start.
What is it about stories that are necessary for not only children but adults?
Necessary for all of us. I think that particularly with kids, but also with adults, it gives you a way, it gives you a language to talk about things that you know instinctually, but you might not have the words for it. And you were saying that your daughter told you the whole story. You asked why she was crying.
Saga.
Yeah, and that's the very thing right there. She's deeply moved, and she can say why, because she has the language of story to say it in.
Yeah, it really does give them a compass almost to take on the world and all the things that they will encounter.
Well, you're using, that's, I loved, it's a compass, it's a blueprint, it's a map, it's a way to, it's a microscope, it's a telescope. That's what story is.
So, Kate DiCamillo, looking at your career. It's amazing. I mean, and your body of work. I've been reading a lot of interviews, and you put persistence above talent. You believe that's more important. Why?
I remember being in writing groups and having somebody much more talented to the left of me and to the right of me, and I watched them as they proceeded. You need to be able to take rejection after rejection after rejection. And then once you get accepted, you need to be able to take criticism after criticism to make it better. And that's all persistence. And I thought, I can't make myself more talented. I can make myself do the work, and I can make myself not give up. And now I'm sitting here talking to you.
Oh,
so,
please.
Yeah.
Madam Ambassador, this is my honor, not yours. Talk about your process for a little bit. 2 pages a day. That's all you do.
Right,
Why
not
do you
much.
restrict yourself to just that?
When I began, because it was a long time before I began. For almost 10 years. I was in college. A professor said, direct quote, "You have a certain facility with words, you should consider graduate school." And at 20, I thought that he was trying to tell me that I was wildly talented and that I was going to be a rich and famous writer. So I thought, why bother with graduate school, right?
Why bother with the graduate school?
And so I spent the next decade talking about being a writer, wanting to be a writer, telling people that I was a writer, wearing black turtlenecks, looking disengaged and like disdainful.
So you were halfway there.
Right. The only thing I wasn't doing was writing,
well,
you know? Yeah. So, and when I started, I thought, at the time that I started, I was running. I could make myself run 2 miles a day. And I thought, here's this thing that I say matters to me more than anything else. So I'll just say, I'm going to do 2 pages a day. 2 miles a day, 2 pages a day.
And you do it every day, no more than that?
When I'm in the No, you know that Hemingway thing about you want to be nice to the you that exists the next day. So if it's a hot day, you stop so that it'll be easier to pick it up the next morning. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've been there. I haven't observed that rule. I come cold that next day, you know. But boy, I got 3 pages the day before. Tell me about the origin stories, if you will, about this. My children and I have been talking about these stories. They cross genres. These characters are very dissimilar, from Despereaux to Edward Tulane. Start with Winn-Dixie, your breakthrough book. Such a beautiful, in some ways painful book.
It is.
Tell me about that book, where it came from.
I grew up in Florida, and right before I started to write, I moved to Minnesota, and I wrote Winn-Dixie the second winter there, which was one of the worst winters on record. Last year was a contender, I have to say.
Part 2.
Right, part 2. And so I was homesick for Florida. I couldn't go home. I didn't have enough money to go home. And also, it was the first time in my life I'd been without a dog. And so I made a dog up. And all of this is looking back in retrospect. I didn't know what I was doing at the time. I was just feeling my way through the story. But that's the origin, and I can look back and say that.
There's a lot of abandonment, disappointment in these stories. Despereaux's mother's disappointed with him. At one point, Abeline's grandmother is disappointed in Edward.
It seems to be a theme, huh?
What is that? Where does that come from? It does linger over the world. That's the only common denominator I see here.
That and friendship.
Yeah.
And there's
redemption.
always, yes. Wow, you have done your homework.
No, my kids have.
Oh, yeah.
I just listen to them and read along. Yeah.
Those things keep on showing up. Why the disappointment? I don't know. I exist perpetually in fear that I will disappoint. I don't know where it comes from, but it certainly ends up in those stories. I have been saved by wonderful friendships in my life, and I have found forgiveness and redemption in stories in those friendships. So.
Wow. Where did Edward Tulane come from? Someone gave you a little China bunny?
I was going to say, again, you've done your research. Yeah, a big China, a big actually melamine, which doesn't have quite the resonance as a word that China does. Yeah, so it's a rabbit made out of melamine, dressed very elegantly, and kind of a creepy rabbit.
Tell me about that book. There's been a lot written about it.
There has been.
And when you read it, he spends 40 days and 40 nights in the garbage dump. He has essentially a Last Supper before he's cast out.
Right.
Tell me about the biblical overtones there.
All unwitting. It's like I can look back and see all of that. None of that is conscious on my part. When people point it out to me, this is the beauty of critics and teachers and librarians. Yeah. It's like people will tell you what is in your book, but it's not always something that I can see until it's done and the book is out in the world. So I'm working on an instinctual kind of basis and plugging into something larger and better than I am.
Animals are very frequent in these works.
Yeah.
They are everywhere. What do animals represent to you? We were talking about Dean Koontz a little while ago.
Yeah.
Dean has always had these Labrador retrievers. He believes they're almost like guardian angels.
Yeah, I would, yes. And almost every book that I've done has an animal in it. And it's gotten to the point where I think I should not put an animal in there, but they keep on showing up, and I think for me they provide, as a writer, a level of safety and comfort. It's what I loved as a child, and I think as readers we're much more inclined to open our heart to an animal protagonist. We trust more quickly there.
Yeah, no, and I know recently you've returned, if you will, to your Mercy Watson roots. Mercy Watson is this lovable pig.
Yes.
That was part of a picture book series. Now you've really done a spin-off.
Yeah.
Tell me about this.
Right, and I didn't, it's
not an animal.
Well, there is an animal in it, though. See, because I can't help myself. It just keeps on happening. There's a horse in it named Maybelline. So there are all these secondary characters in those Mercy Watson books, and I thought I missed Mercy, and I thought I want to do more, and how can I do more in a different way? So I thought I'll take these secondary characters and tell their stories. So this is Leroy Ninker, a reformed thief. He stole a toaster from the Watson household.
A wannabe cowboy.
Right, and he also wants to be a cowboy, and he gets a horse that he hopes when he goes to purchase this horse that the horse's name is going to be Tornado instead, It is Maybelline. Yeah.
and mayhem ensues. Tell me, when you start a new project, are you still trepidatious? Are you still fearful?
Oh, I am fear incarnate right here. This is me. Yeah, I'm always terrified. And I've learned to not wish that away. It's part of the whole thing for me. I don't ever know what's going to happen in a story. It's the wonderful.
Outlining.
No, it's that Elmer Leonard quote, if I knew what was going to happen, I wouldn't write the story. I write to find out. Wow. And that has a certain element of fear in it, but also self-discovery. So it's just the way it is.
That's
right?
so scary to me. I just finished my first children's book, and it took me years. But I had to outline this thing. I couldn't imagine.
But everybody works
blind.
differently. I mean, I have so many friends who write, and there are some people that would never think about doing a novel without outlining first. I can't do it. Mm-hmm. I've tried, and as soon as I outline it, I don't want to write it.
It's dead to you.
Yeah, exactly.
Isn't
so
something?
There's no right way. And congratulations on your book.
Well, well, read it first. You may not be so congratulatory, but I'll send you a copy. E.B. White had that great line that writing is an act of faith, not an act of grammar.
I didn't know that line. I love that. And I love E.B. White.
Yeah,
so thank you.
One of the most beautiful writers.
Say it again.
Writing is an act of faith, not an act of grammar.
Right. But you need to use the grammar to get to the faith.
Right. Does your personal faith ever work its way into the works?
All of me works its way in there. The whole of me is revealed on the page. Anybody who is writing necessarily reveals himself even when they think that they're hiding. So every part of me is on there. Yes.
I'm going to start this new literacy campaign. It's called Rays of Wonder, which kind of aligns nicely with your work. What would be your advice to parents and to the kids themselves about encouraging this lifelong love of reading and reading nourishing works, not just comic books? I've interviewed others who said, oh, if they're reading comic books, that's fine. Let them read anything. Do you agree with that?
I say let them start wherever they want to start, and they'll find their way. But as far as, and now I get to put on the ambassadorial, is that an hat, and say, reading together, letting your children see you reading a book for your own pleasure, not making it a task, making it a privilege and a joy and a celebration, and also just a way to engage with each other. Have your child read to you, you read to your child. But so many people, 15 minutes you have to read. Don't do that.
Yeah, why?
You get to read. You get to read. It is an absolute privilege, and there is nowhere in this country that you can't go and get a book. We have libraries everywhere. It's available to everybody, and it's a privilege.
Kate DiCamillo, this has been a privilege for me and for us. Thank you.
Thank
you. Thank you for your work. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Before we go, I'm planning to launch a brand new literacy initiative, one that will recommend wondrous and nourishing works for kids and their families. But I need your help. If you're an educator or a librarian, or perhaps a very well-read parent who'd like to submit a list of your favorite books and perhaps become an ongoing contributor to my new site, I want you to drop me an email. I'm at Raymond@RaymondArroyo.com. It's easy to remember. Put books in the subject line. I would love to hear about your reading lists and your tips for getting kids to read. I've got a big announcement coming soon, and I'll share this initiative with you, so stay tuned for that, and thank you for participating. Finally, I've always believed if you have access to the public, you should use it to do some good. This week I received a number of prayer requests from people who are facing very difficult situations, and I ask you to remember them in your prayers. A viewer wrote me about her friend Kath Heffernan, who's battling non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. You keep fighting. And two personal friends are contending with cancer, Kathy Morrison in Williamsburg and my pal John in New Orleans. I thank you for keeping all of these folks in your thoughts and your prayers. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter. Let me know what you thought of tonight's show, and the links are at RaymondArroyo.com. Do not miss next week's show. In the meantime, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. We'll see you next time. Bye now.